Hey folks. Now, many of you may be aware of the fact that across the internet and across politics in Western countries in general, there is a very shallow analysis of fascism. Marxists have always understood fascism in economic terms. They've understood that when society enters a crisis and the rate of profit is dropping, mass unemployment, mass hunger, instability in the economy, the capitalist class will try to stabilize society, and they will use government power to try and stabilize society. And that their methods of stabilizing society will often involve beating people down, putting people in prison camps, setting up an authoritarian state, building up the military and preparing for war. And that these methods of society kind of locking down amid a state of crisis, and then the state utilizing methods of destruction to stabilize the economy, that this is fascism. And fascism justifies itself in many different ways, all kinds of different rhetoric. There's German National Socialism, there's Italian Fascisti, there's Franco in Spain, there's Pinochet's Chile, but there are many different ideologies used to justify it, but it's basically a phenomenon that breaks out in capitalist societies. Now, that is a scientific Marxist definition of fascism. However, all across the Western left, you have all these voices like Susan Sontag, like Hannah Arendt, and many of the voices that are now influencing those who are talking about fascism in this age in which Donald Trump is accused of being a fascist, in which leftists who are anti-imperialist are being accused of fascist. These forces, they have a definition of fascism that is aesthetic, right? That they have this image in their mind, the image that comes to mind when you think of Hitler or Mussolini, right? Of a guy in a uniform pounding on a podium, people in uniforms cheering him, saluting him. They think that fascism is basically that. It's an aesthetic. It's an image that comes into their mind. If something looks like a guy in a uniform pounding on a podium, a bunch of people also in uniform saluting him, that is fascism, right? And that's what they think. And that this non-scientific fascism is a feeling, fascism is a vibe. This feeling has just seeped into left-wing circles. And what's interesting is a lot of Trotskyites repeat this, right? The people who defend the Soviet Union, people who defend North Korea, well, they're fascists because, the image I have in my head of North Korea is somebody at a podium screaming and yelling and pounding and wearing a uniform, and then there's people in a uniform saluting this person in a uniform, so therefore it's fascist, right? It's this simplistic, childlike definition of fascism. Fascism is when stuff looks in a certain way that makes me uncomfortable and reminds me of what the Nazis were. That's fascism. And a lot of Trotskyites fall into this. A lot of social democrats fall into this. But what's particularly funny about this, understanding of fascism that has nothing to do with economics, nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with historical materialism. It's just fascism is stuff that makes me feel a certain way, right? What's particularly funny about that is that probably the person who pioneered those aesthetics that we associate with fascism, that are the definition of fascism according to these delusional people, is Trotsky, right? During the Russian Civil War, Leon Trotsky was the main propagandist for the Red Army, and he essentially, throughout the Russian Civil War, he went, from Red Army camp and Red Army base to Red Army camp and Red Army base around the country, doing exactly what folks who think, that folks think fascism is. Trotsky, he put on this, intense uniform with a visor helmet and leather pants and a big long coat, and he went from military base to military base, giving these big fiery speeches to crowds of soldiers. Before he would come, they would line up all the deserters, people who tried to desert from the Red Army, and they'd be going to execute them by firing squad. But then Trotsky would arrive and save their lives, and it was this big emotional thing. During his speeches, he would pull a gold watch out of his coat and pick a random soldier and give them a gold watch, right? And then it was the biggest, it was the most military, most fiery song and dance, political theatrics speech you ever heard of. That's what Trotsky spent the Russian Civil War doing, right? And many Trotskyists have it in their mind that Trotsky was the big military strategist during the Russian Civil War, That's not the case. Trotsky was the front man. He was the propagandist for the Red Army during the Russian Civil War. And he was quite good at it. And what's interesting is what Trotsky did during the Russian Civil War was studied by the Nazis, right? And the Nazis were obsessed with communist propaganda, right? Joseph Goebbels said that his favorite movie was Battleship Potemkin. And that the Nazis very much tried to study the effective methods of communist propaganda and apply it to their fascist movement, right? These aesthetics that people think are explicitly and only fascist, most of which were picked up from communism, right? The communists, they used to march with red armbands. Well, the Nazis, they marched with red armbands also. They just had swastikas on them. The Nazis, they had a salute. Well, that came from the fact the communists had their salute, right? And that these are just things you do when you are trying to build an effective mass movement, right? And the Nazis were building a fascist reactionary movement. They co-opted a lot of the aesthetics from communism, right? Because they saw it was an effective way to build a mass movement. There was a big Marxist and communist movement long before there was a big fascist movement. And communists and Marxists had pioneered some of these aesthetic methods of building a mass movement. And the speech method, right? The guy in a military uniform giving a very fiery speech that gets people pumped up, and the audience, they're also in uniforms. Trotsky's speeches during the Russian Civil War, Trotsky's entire role during the Russian Civil War was that aesthetic. That's what Trotsky did during the Russian Civil War. So if you are going to declare that those aesthetics that you don't like are Nazbol or red-brown and all that, you should hate Trotsky, right? The reason that the synthetic leftists like Trotsky is they see him as an intellectual, they see him as against the Soviet Union. Of course, they hate the Soviet Union. They hate all anti-imperialist countries, right? Because, they're basically just trying to build a left case for interventions and wars and CIA-led revolutions against those countries. So they hate anti-imperialist countries. Trotsky hated the Soviet Union. Trotsky, they have the image of him. He wrote a lot of books, so he's an intellectual, right? And so they have this image of Trotsky as this nerdy intellectual who didn't like the Soviet Union, when the reality is that Trotsky's actual role was as a fiery speech maker in a military uniform. So what's really ironic is that all these people who think that fascist aesthetics prove that you're a Stalinist and that Trotsky was a good leftist who didn't have these fascist aesthetics. What's ironic about all of that is that these fascist aesthetics that they hate so much were blatantly plagiarized from Trotsky.